I didn't want fear to be a defining aspect of how I lived my life. And I continually tried to challenge myself to do things that will alleviate that tension and that stress. People are incredibly adaptable. After 2 weeks of living in the boat, I realized that it's all going to be okay. And I can be happy under a myriad of circumstances. I just needed to take the time to adapt to it.
That was John Guider. John is a naturalist, an internationally recognized photographer, and an author whose work is in a number of national museums, prestigious corporate and private collections throughout the country, as well as in the Arts in Embassies program. His water journeys, first by canoe and later in a 14.5-foot rowboat with a sail that he built himself, have brought him tremendous recognition as he explores and brings history to life. John retraced the 1,000-mile river route of John Donaldson's founding of Nashville. The trip was so impressive, it later was recreated and told in a documentary by Nashville Public Television. John's book, The Voyage of Adventure, showcases his journey to illuminate the contrasts and similarities between life then and now. Join us to meet and learn more about this adventure seeker, explorer, and documentarian who looks at and celebrates life through a different lens.
I'm Sally Hussey, the CEO of 50 Forward, and we're glad you joined us to hear inspiring stories from older adults. Their words of wisdom are well worth sharing as we seek to navigate a meaningful and purpose-driven second chapter in our life. This podcast is made possible through the work of 50 Forward and our mission to support, champion, and enhance the lives of those 50 and older.
Today's Squeeze the Day is brought to you by the All of Us Research Program from the National Institutes of Health. Learn how you can help change the future of health by participating in the program. Visit www.joinallofus.org to learn more. I'm Susan Sizemore, Communications Director of 50 Forward. So let's get started. Welcome, John. This is a far cry from paddling down a river or doing things that you normally do behind the camera lens. So I'm really excited to have you join us today.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
How do you define yourself?
Well, I'm human. I guess I consider myself a little, shy, but reserved and quiet, but very, very curious about life and all the good stuff.
So given your background, and I have to say I've had a ball researching you, I know you've had a lot of media coverage, but there are some really interesting stories, and I'm just excited to talk to you about them. So let's start with, you seem to have a quest to recreate or understand history in such a different way, and I'm just curious, why is that so important to you?
I've always liked to look backwards to see how our forefathers did it, and it's sort of trying to see if where we have come is better or worse. Are we happier? Obviously, we're better off on a lot of health standpoints, but other than that, it's such an interesting difference. Even 150 years has made in our human existence. So there is a curiosity. And I like to reinvent things. When I was starting out in photography, I wanted to make my own camera. I wanted to have that kind of control. And I think that is what gives me confidence to go forward.
That's so interesting. A lot of folks reinvent themselves in their second chapter. What compelled you not only to do that, but also to recreate the river journey of John Donaldson and the founding of Nashville?
Well, it started out in 2003 when I solo paddled the entirety of the Mississippi in a canoe, and having had no prior really canoeing or camping experience. I had a little, but not much. And I had read about Demonbreun, and he was one of our first inhabitants in Nashville, and how he would collect the pelts and then build a raft and take them down to New Orleans to sell, and then hike back on the Natchez Trace and do it again and again and again. And it was something that I felt I wanted to experience. I've always liked boats. I've always enjoyed the water. And I'm the most comfortable when I'm in nature. I feel surrounded by the world that God created. And it's just such an enjoyable part of my living that, I can't get enough of it. The other thing is that I was an advertising photographer before this, but I had always wanted to be an artist. And when you tell anybody in the arts that you want to be an artist, the first thing they say is prepare to starve. It's not an easy field. So the advertising photography was creative, and it gave me a sense of creativity, but it also provided subsistence for my family. But in 2003, at the age of 54, my children were full grown, and I really had a canvas that was wide open. And I wanted to do something unique and entirely my own. If you're an artist, one of the worst things that somebody can say of your work is that it's derivative. It looks like Picasso, it looks like Monet. An artist is supposed to go forward and not backwards. So I knew people had paddled the Mississippi, but I didn't know of anyone who had paddled it with a high-resolution camera. And so I wanted to be the first to capture that environment and show it to the rest of the world, to let the people know how special it is and how it does need to be protected. And so that was my mission. After I completed the 2,500-mile paddle down the Mississippi, I felt compelled to go forward and do things I'd never done before. And the one thing I had never really done is build anything. So I decided this time I'm going to build my own boat. And it's a 14.5-foot rowboat with a sail, no motor. And I decided to go on a journey called the Great Loop. And it's a 6,500-mile water course that I started in Nashville, regained the Ohio and the Mississippi down to the Gulf, all the way along the coast to Key West, up the eastern seaboard to New York City. I accessed the Hudson all the way up north to Lake Ontario, crossed the Great Lakes, regained the Illinois at Chicago, down the Illinois, back to the Mississippi, and then back towards the Ohio and Nashville. And it was over a course of 6 years. I'd go out for 2 months every summer, and maybe make about 1,000 miles. And then wherever I stopped, that's where I would begin again the next year. And it was an incredible experience. And I ended up writing a journal that was over 500 pages long and have 20,000 photographs. So I actually don't know what to do with them. But while I was doing that journey, this little boat became very special to me because I was living in it. And it was sort of my cocoon at night. And I wanted to give it a name, and I couldn't figure out the right name. I tried some Indian narratives, and my wife wouldn't let me name it after her. And then one day I was down at the public square in Nashville, and I saw a little statement about John Donaldson. and how he and the Good Boat Adventure came to settle Nashville from up in East Tennessee. And I was so taken by what he did and what he accomplished. And I realized that I had set out basically at the same point where he landed. So I decided to name my boat the Adventure 2. And then after I finished these journeys, I wanted to understand our history and dive deep into it and learn how Nashville became Nashville and what our forefathers had to go through. And basically, he started up on the Holston River, came down to the Tennessee, to the Ohio, and then back up the Cumberland. It was a 1,000-mile water course. And he did it in a raft with 45 people on board and ended up having all sorts of adventures himself. The main ones were being attacked by the Native Americans along the way, and then encountering the rapids and stuff like that. Also, the difficulty in trying to feed himself after such a long journey. I enjoyed learning, and I just decided to follow that path, not to recreate it, but to document it in a way that would give contrast to what he saw and what I was seeing, and allow people to decide if our journey forward was better or not.
Mm-hmm. So a number of questions come to mind from your story, but one thing that I just want to ask, I know academically you studied engineering, and did engineering play a role in all of this? Because really you moved into advertising and marketing and photography totally outside of the engineering spectrum. So just kind of curious about that fit.
Yeah, I've always wanted to be an artist from a very early age. My father was an industrialist and very practical. He enjoyed art, but it was not a career. So he basically told me he would pay for college under the condition I studied one of two things, accounting or engineering. And I decided on engineering. I was good at math, and I had a lot of questions that needed to be answered. I really actually enjoyed the philosophy of the sciences, and it was very helpful to me. But I was stubborn in my desire to be an artist. While I was at Vanderbilt, I joined the yearbook staff as a photographer and just became enthralled with that aspect. So when I graduated, I took a job processing film for a local photographer at about $150 a week, and my father was not too thrilled, but Nashville was growing at such a rate that I was able to grow with it, and it turned out to be a very good experience.
That's so interesting about the role a parent plays, and I can think of a number of individuals even now that I know of who have been in similar circumstances, and eventually life sorts itself out the way it's supposed to. But I want to go back to life lessons. Along the way and your river journeys, you encountered some really dangerous situations, as well as you discovered and really pointed out in some of your writings and other interviews, interesting paradoxes about our life today. And I just wondered if you wanted to share a few of those or a couple stories.
Well, one of my motivations for doing things is that I didn't want fear to be a defining aspect of how I lived my life. And I continually tried to challenge myself to do things that will alleviate that tension and that stress. So that was part of the motivation for attempting these journeys. The other thing is nature. And what I found when I started the Mississippi journey is how adaptable human beings are. When I started, the first couple days were as miserable as I could be. I packed the wrong kind of foods. I packed fruits. I thought that was healthy. In the 100-degree heat, they all rotted and melted and spoiled the canoe. And I just learned stuff. But what was interesting, whenever I reached a town like Clarksville or Paducah, I wanted to treat myself to a hotel, to actually have a shower and a bath and have a real full dinner. And I made my way down the Mississippi, and by the time I got to Louisiana, I stopped doing that. I was more comfortable in my tent. I wanted to be with my boat. I was just so happy in the motion of doing it, I didn't want to disrupt it. And I realized that one of the things about people are they are incredibly adaptable. I mean, they're humans living on the high mountains, in the desert, everywhere you think, there's probably a human being pretty close by. And what I found was that after 2 weeks in the boat, I had adapted perfectly well. And it was a neat revelation because, I had concerns about my future and my health and whether I was going to have money to do stuff and things like that. And after 2 weeks of living in the boat, I realized that it's all going to be okay. And I can be happy under a myriad of circumstances. I just needed to take the time to adapt to it. And those trips were incredible because my average daily expenditure was less than $20 a day. And I was having the time of my life. And I was seeing things and enjoying the world. And it cost me absolutely nothing. So whenever I left, I would actually come back wealthier financially than when I began. And there were other things too. I've always considered myself an introvert. And after 5 days of being on the river and not talking to a single soul or seeing a single person, the first person I met, I would just talk his or her head off. They would just look at me and laugh. And I realized, too, that I needed the company of people. I needed that. So I just learned so much about myself. And then the health aspects are incredible. Paddling 12, 14 hours a day, I think I lost 40 pounds in weight. And I came back healthier and stronger as a 54-year-old than I had ever been in my life. And I was active and I was happy and I was free of colds and things that I normally would get in a normal life. So I realized the health aspects. And then, of course, the nature. When you're on a canoe, it's sort of a stealth mode. You're very, very quiet. There's no engine. And you pass the riverbank, and you can see the critters doing their normal activities. And it was fun to see how they reacted to one another and how they were tolerant and how one animal might make way for another animal. And they were all just sort of at peace and happy in their existence. They shared a lot of emotions that I thought were strictly human, but they did know how to enjoy life, and they did know how to interact with each other, and they did know how to care for one another. It was very revelatory for me.
It's so interesting to hear kind of the aha moments that you share about the journey overall. And you mentioned in something that you had written that you struggle with dyslexia. And some of the things that you are experiencing are probably models that we could share with others. How do you work through that in your life?
Well, I think it has created a course in my life. I sort of had some writing talent. I don't quite know how good I am, but I couldn't spell. And so it was so frustrating that I think I turned more to the visual arts as a way to express myself. I journaled on the Mississippi, and it was such a profound experience. When I came back, if somebody asked about it, I'd ask them if they had 2 months for me to, tell them the stories. And I tried to write a book, and it was difficult. The dyslexia, I could write maybe 5-10 minutes a day, and then the headaches were so bad I had to stop. So it just went on and on and on. Nowadays with a computer and spell check, it's a little easier for me. I think it did set a course for me in my life.
So I'm curious about some of the things that you had to work through with your family, especially in dedicating a life to the arts and dealing with dyslexia. Do you have advice for others who might be following similar paths?
I think you have to sort of fix on priorities. When I had my family and my kids, they had to be my priority. I wanted to be creative, but I had to find a way to satisfy both. And then as I became more and more independent, both financially and from the responsibility of raising children, I was able to go out and be a little more expressive artistically. I was divorced prior to these journeys, and then during the Mississippi journey, I married a wonderful woman, and she was tolerant of what I wanted to do. And it was very special, and it made me want to make sure that I could do something in return.
Are there photos or locations, are there places that you just feel like are among your favorites?
There's something about the Mississippi that just speaks to me. And you grow up with Mark Twain, you grow up with that lore, and then you get on it, and it's magical. The neat thing about the Mississippi is once you get below St. Louis, there are no dams. The river at many points is as much as a mile wide. There is barge traffic, but the river's so wide, you very rarely encounter, any difficulties. The pleasure boats, they'll head up the Tennessee River to get on the Tom Bigby. So, because there just aren't many places to refuel once you get below Cairo. You basically have the whole river to yourself.
Very interesting. Because you touched on it, I'd love for you to just briefly share the adventure that took you through the locks and a dam that ended up being a bit of a misfortune.
I did the Mississippi in 2 phases. The first phase, I started on the Harpeth River, got to the Cumberland, to the Ohio, and then turned left at Cairo and went down the Mississippi. Then 2 years later, I decided I needed to do the entire river, so I went up to Lake Itasca. And between Lake Itasca and Cairo, there are 10 fixed dams, which you have to portage. I mean, it's crazy. I was pulling my canoe across highways just to get to the other side. And these were man-made dams for irrigation purposes. Once you get to Minneapolis, it's a navigable river, so they build dams and locks to keep the water elevation high and also to aid in industry as well. I can't remember the exact number, but I had at least 15 locks and dams to go through. And they're not as dangerous as people think. I remember the first time I went through a lock, there were a bunch of fishermen below the dam because it's a good fishing area. And then I used my VHF radio to get them to open the doors. And when I went in, all the other fishermen scooted away. They just didn't want to have anything to do with it. What you have to do when you're at the locks, you call the lock master and tell him what you're doing. The commercial boats have right of way, and a lot of times they have to break up the barges, so it can take. I've sat at a lock for 12 hours waiting to get through.
Oh, wow.
And at this one particular lock, I was sitting, and it was about a 3 or 4 hour wait, and a guy in a houseboat hailed me, and I went over and talked to him, and we talked and enjoyed. And he was from up north and had bought a houseboat at a yard sale, and somebody told him that if he took it down to New Orleans, he could sell it for 10 times what he paid for it. So that's what he was going to do. And he had very, this was his first experience. We talked enough, and we drifted back into the lake, and they finally cleared the lock. And I realized that it was going to take me a half hour to paddle to the lock. So the guy offered to pull the boat up to the lock, and that would give me the time to get through. So I agreed, and he started the engine, and it became very obvious he didn't know what he was going to do, because he swung his boat so hard that it swamped my boat.
Oh.
And we were about 100 yards from the dam in the middle of the river. And so I jumped in and tried to collect all my gear because it was floating toward the dam. And I started grabbing stuff, and I had it, and I realized that the current was about to take me over the dam. The current was strong enough that I couldn't swim out of it. The guy in the houseboat had no idea what was going on. Fortunately, one of the people from the Corps of Engineers spotted me. He sent out a boat, and right as I was 15 yards from going over the dam, they got me to the boat, and they said, you're in the red zone. We're allowed to rescue you, but we can't take your gear. And then I said, well, then I'm just going to go with the gear. And they finally relented and grabbed everything, got me on the boat. The guy in the houseboat had pulled my canoe up to his boat, and we locked through, and the whole time the guy just yelled at me for being a stupid idiot. But we got to the other side. I saved all my camping gear, but all of my camera gear floated to the bottom of the lake. It was too heavy. And so it basically ruined the trip for me. And I had to make my way back to Minneapolis, get my car, and drive home and start fresh the next year. But it was quite an experience for sure.
I think your next book will be The 9 Lives of John Guider.
Possibly.
So now that you've completed the Great Loop, and you're one of only a handful of people who have done it in a non-motorized vessel, what's next on your horizon?
Oh, there's so much. I'm going to go back to the Badlands of the Missouri and paddle that, and that's just a wonderful water course. Last night I was looking at Grand Canyon tours, and I thought that might be a nice idea. I built a new boat, which is bigger and sleeker. It's still a rowboat. It still has oars, but it's a big sailboat, 18 feet long. And a few years ago, I attempted to sail it to Alaska.
Wow.
I started in Port Townsend and wanted to get to Ketchikan, about 650 miles away. And about a third of the way up, I got caught in a whirlpool, and the ship blew over, capsized, and I landed in frigid North Pacific water. It was a Sunday evening. Nobody was on the water. And fortunately, I found my VHF radio and was able to call the Canadian Coast Guard and give them my location. But the nearest Coast Guard station was about 40 miles away. And finally, they put out an all-points bulletin, and a fishing vessel found me about 45 minutes into the disaster. They pulled me aboard and were very, very good about treating me for hypothermia, warming me up. And the Coast Guard did show up, and the medic that attended me said I probably had about 5 minutes left.
Oh, my gosh.
I could feel the hypothermia affecting me and moving up my body. They say when you're in a hypothermic situation, your body knows to send all the heat to your brain so that you can at least try to figure this out. And it was an incredible experience because I really didn't know that I was going to make it. And people talk about seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and I was starting to get that tunnel vision. But what was interesting was the fact that I could have possibly died didn't really bother me. It felt like a restful, deserved sleep at the end of a very hard day of work. And my biggest concern was what it was going to do to my family and my kids, and I regretted giving them that pain. And but it was interesting. One of those experiences I'm glad I had. I wouldn't have volunteered to have it, but now that I have it, I kind of have a sense of what it is to pass away.
That is incredible. So I have a few simple questions that I'm going to call snapshots just for you. What would you tell your younger self?
Go forward. Don't be afraid.
Who would you like to trade places with for 24 hours?
I'd be interested in someone like Van Gogh. That would be a little crazy, but yeah, I'd like to understand his passion.
As a creative, whose work has influenced you most?
Ansel Adams. I loved his work, and he was such a good nature photographer, and he kind of understood the science of photography as well as the art of photography. So I tried hard to learn from him and his books.
Then we have a couple questions that we ask all of our guests. And the first one is, what's one piece of advice your parents or an older adult might have shared with you that at the time you thought was silly, but now that phrase rings true to you in your everyday life?
I think it's work hard, go forward.
And what's the one thing or what's the thing that you do to squeeze the day?
I was thinking, Mona and I were watching a documentary on Mae West, and I was taken by one of her quotes, which is, they say you only have one life to live, but if you do it well, it's enough. So my advice is to do it well.
Excellent. Well, John, I want to thank you for joining us today. Your story is inspiring and reinforces that challenges can become opportunities. We can all learn so much from one another and certainly from the experiences of those in their second chapter of life. Now we challenge everyone listening to go squeeze the day. Squeeze the Day is made possible through listeners like you. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us continue to share inspiring stories of older adults and visit 50forward.org to make a contribution. That's FIFTYFORWARD.org. Let's support, champion, and enhance the lives of older adults together.